The storm announced them before any sail hissed close enough to glimpse the white churn against the black teeth of Shipbreaker Bay. It came like a procession of drums rolling in from the southern horizon, the sky a bruise that deepened by the heartbeat, the scent of iron and rain washing the decks clean of the eastern spices that clung to planks despite months at sea. Lightning sheeted the cloud bank and carved a pale mask upon the sea, and in that uncanny flash John Cunnington saw three things: the leaping silhouettes of men bent to their work, the taut, shuddering lines of rigging thrumming with wet, and the boy standing in the bow with his hair cropped short and dyed the muddy black of riverbanks. His face turned unblinking to the storm that would bear him home. "You should come below," John shouted over the wind. "You gain nothing from proving you can stare down a gale." The boy did not look back. He had his mother's mouth, people said. The mother John had never known, who had been ash and rumor in foreign courts long before this boy had learned to hold a blade correctly. It was the eyes that undid John, the color of a high mountain sky on a frostbitten morning, hard and clear and full of distances. In certain lights they belonged to a ghost who had once played a harp in a summer tent while the wind made the silk walls sigh. "I would watch my first sight of Westeros," Aegon said, "and I would smell it. I want it to strike me like a bell." "It will strike you like a cudgel if that rain worsens," John muttered. He would have smiled for another man, another boy, another life. He studied the coastline, blind between lightning. The cape fanned to the north like a hand half-submerged. The weeping town lay beyond that finger of land, a hooked shore backed with the soft hills and sodden woods of the Rainwood. Storm's End brooded on its promontory farther east, a presence even when it could not be seen, the old defiance of Durin the young fool. John could feel it, like the memory of a scar under cloth. A gust caught the ship abeam and the galley, the maiden's tongue, chartered under a Lysini name that was no true name at all, healed sickly, but the oars bit and the sailors bent in unity, and she corrected. "Robson." A man on the forecastle spat and crossed himself in the manner of whatever god followed him across waters. "Stormlands sailors call these winds the king's wrath," said Halden Halfmester, appearing at John's shoulder, hood pressed to his skull with long fingers. "They say Aegon the Conqueror chose this bay for a reason, to make red men and blue men quake equally." "Blue men," Aegon called without turning. "Those sworn to the Seven," Halden said. "Their robes, their iconography. Ignore me. I read too much and speak it poorly." His breath plumed in the chill. "We will be sighted if the weeping town keeps a watch, storm or no." "We will be sighted," John said. "The point is who sees and who understands what he sees." It had been arranged in chambers that never knew rain. Silver fattened too many purses in the weeping town for eyes to sharpen when they should dull. He glanced aft. Harry Strickland stood under the awning with the other officers of the Golden Company, features composed into that bland caution that had carried him safely through decades of learning when to advance and when to retreat. He had left his elephants in the east and packed his doubts in their stead. "Are your men ready?" John called. Strickland's answer carried when the wind dipped. "Ready to put oars in and out like any other poor bastard, Lord Griff." The title bit. John had worn many names and none had fit him since youth. In the east he had taken a cloak and dyed his hair, and a boy called him father in fear or cruel jest. Who could say? And John had taught that boy to sit a saddle and think like a prince without letting him be one. Now the mummery thinned. Years of exile pressed behind John's heart like a weight that might break him if he breathed too deep. Lightning bit again. A blue-white seam ripped across the clouds. And in that instant the shore with its gaunt dead timbers jutting and its shingled beach and the suggestion of low houses leapt into being and then vanished. The rain came then, a slanting wall. Men bent to it. The world narrowed to rope underhand, would beneath boot, the short command to strike sail and ship oars. They coasted, crabwise, the current and the oarsmaster's skill conspiring to bring them to the lee of the point, where the water flattened to a gray skin and the wind's fingers lost their strength. "Now," John said, a whistle trilled low and thin. From the shadow of the clumsy Lysini merchant astern of them, the first of the smaller boats drifted out, boats that had hung alongside like barnacles, their hulls black as the water. The men within them moved with care that belied their arms and mail, The Golden Company did not rattle when it meant to whisper. Raleigh Duckfield grinned as if there were sun and women to be had rather than cold and risk. He had a butcher's shoulders and the patience of a man who had learned to stand still for hours waiting for cattle to look the wrong way. "Hold," Jon said, and he laid a hand on the boy's forearm. Aegon looked down at that hand, then at Jon. He did not pull away, but the angle of his chin said he would remember. "You promised I would be first ashore, and you will be," Jon said. He let go. The first prince in 2 decades to set foot in the Stormlands without begging a Baratheon's leave. The boy's mouth twitched. "I thought I came to claim a kingdom, not beg." "You came to buy," Haldon said softly. "With steel, with word, with memory. Sometimes a prince pays with the softness in his face when he is tired and refuses to show it. Weariness is a currency kings pay without counting." Aegon laughed. A short sound as if he were unaccustomed to hearing his own amusement in weather like this. "Every man about me seeks to teach me some new thing in every moment. If I live a year, I shall be the wisest ruler Westeros has known." "If you live a year," Jon said, "you will be insufferable. Watch the oars. There. The point. Not so much as a lantern showing." Good. They came in under rain, under the screaming of terns driven inland, under the iron smell of storms. The boats grounded one after another with soft, grating thuds. Men leapt into water to their thighs and shoved, boots finding purchase on stones that slipped. Jon and Aegon went together down the ladder, the boy unsteady only in that he seemed to want to be everywhere at once. To feel the first cold bite of home upon his shins and to be first to the lip, first up the bank and into whatever waited. The beach was a crescent of stones and black sand and driftwood ribs. Beyond it, a wall of gnarled low trees bent inland as if supplicating to a god far from the sea. The weeping town crouched behind the trees. Fishermen's huts, a cobbled square slick with rain, a tired sept with a bell whose mouth drank water even as it filled with it, and an inn whose sign, the drowned daughter, swung on chains and shrieked like a thing alive. There were men standing under the eaves of the inn and the sept. Heads canted into the rain not as watchers but as men who could not help but look into a storm. Jon could feel their surprise. Surprise became confusion. Confusion became calculation, and calculation, in poor towns of the realm, had always known that gold outweighed fear when gold came in the right purses. Aegon stepped onto wet pebbles and closed his eyes. The rain struck his face in hard little needles. He opened his mouth to it as if taking sacrament. Jon watched, and where he should have felt contempt for any boy's boyishness, he felt instead something that was not hope. He was too old for that word, but the ache that comes when a hand is extended to you across a dark room and you cannot help but reach for it. "Your Grace," said a voice, matter of fact, the Stormlands in it like salt. The woman who had spoken wore a shawl that had once been blue, and a bundle at her hip that might have been fish or a child. She had the beaten look of a field that a farmer had run out of patience with. She did not kneel. Her expression said kneeling was for better days and cleaner floors. "Not your king yet," Aegon answered. He shook the water from his short hair, and for an instant it darkened so that Jon saw the pale at the roots, saw silver snake like a secret under the dye. The boy was not tall, not heavy, but when he stood still he could make a line with his spine that commanded a room. "But I hope to be the best thing that happens to you this year. My roof came off last week," the woman said. "A better thing would be a roof." "We'll buy your roof," Raleigh Duckfield said cheerfully, coming up with a pair of men behind him whose faces said they took cheer in the breaking of bones more than in good ale. "Or we'll nail it down for you. Depends where your loyalties lie." "My loyalties lie to my boat," the woman said, "and to my boy here who coughs blood lately. But I know what colors mean." She lifted her chin toward the ships that rode gray in the rain. "I suppose if you came to cut throats, you'd have done it in the night." "We came to pay," Aegon said, "and to be paid. Will you take silver for fresh fish and the use of your inn kitchen?" She studied him. "You sound very young." "I am," Aegon said, and there was no insult in the admission. "Your name?" "Maris," she said. "And this is my town to the extent that any one woman can claim anything in it." "Then Maris of the Weeping Town," Aegon said, water running down his cheeks like tears and not discomfiting him in the least. Sell to us, she nodded. So long as you keep your men from running their hands where they shouldn't. I can't promise what my boys will do if they do. They have nets and hooks and no patience. Duck, Jon said. We'll post men, Duck answered. We know what happens when sellswords mistake a roof for a right. Harry Strickland strode up then. His thinning hair pasted to his brow and a look of someone who had been brought to a feast he did not trust. We must move quickly to the roost, he said to Jon, low, keeping his voice beneath the rain. The longer we sit on a beach, the more time we give to ravens. Jon nodded. Half go now, half secure the town. I'll take the first half. Duck, Halden, Lemore stays with the boy. No, Aegon said. We go together. You will do as I say, Jon said, and for a beat the rain was the only sound between them that mattered. The boy's jaw set. He looked as if he would throw the command back at Jon like a stone. Together, Aegon repeated, in a quieter register, and it was compromise, not defiance. If I mean to be a prince in truth, then the roost is the first stone in my house. I will walk through its gate with you. Jon let out the slowest of breaths. Very well. Halden, will find us a scribe unwilling to be sober in this weather, Halden said. The proclamations we prepared will read better with names spelt as locals spell them. The Seven have a perverse humor when a lord signs his name incorrectly in the Stormlands. You have too many books inside your skull to leave room for sense, Duck told him. Come along, little prince. Aegon gave him a look that held more fondness than irritation. I'm taller than you, Duck. You are taller and I am wider, Duck said. Between us we'll make the right shape for a king. High and broad. They moved. The Golden Company flowed into the town and through it like water, finding every low place. Most of the weeping town huddled under thatch and listened hard. A boy with hair plastered to his forehead ran alongside Aegon for 20 steps and then fell back as if afraid he had been too bold. A septon with a dark fringe of hair and a mouth that had known better wine than this town could usually afford peered from the open sept doors and made 3 signs of blessing hurriedly in the air, as if to cover 3 different possible outcomes. They took the road that threaded into the trees. It climbed gently, a damp ribbon between trunks bearded with moss. Water ran everywhere. Down from the earth itself, it seemed, seeping from the bank to make little tongues and rivulets that sought the road and crossed it and made it a map of narrow, shining streams. The rain softened everything, made blade and boot leather and human breath all of a piece. Jon listened for the one sound he prized above all, the silence that says you have not yet been noticed by men with horns and horses. He heard only rain and the dull thud of his own blood and the soft grunt of men taking weight from their packs with small readjustments of shoulder and strap. Griffin's roost came upon them as if it had grown there from the bones of the hill. It had the red stone that had given it and Jon's house its name. It had walls that knew 36 foolish boys' scrapes on hot summer days, and a godswood beyond whose trees had eavesdropped on vows made and broken. It had, most of all, the look of a thing abandoned by half its pride, as if standing had cost it too much. Jon tasted rust in his mouth. He thought of running this hill when he was 15, breath in his throat and a man's sword in his hand that he was still learning to be worthy of. He thought of Rhaegar's laughter when it came rarely and glimmered like precious metal in mud. Lord Ronnet will be away, Halden said low. He keeps to Lord Renly's train, they say. If he were here, he would be up on that wall making a show of it, Duck muttered. I know the sort. You know all sorts, Jon said. It was not barbed, not exactly. He raised his hand and the men behind him stilled. The gate was shut but not barred. Traces of haste lived in scuffs on the yard stones at the base, as if men had dragged something heavy through hurriedly. A cart of grain, a small cannon, the wrong word for the wrong world, but the image persisted, and then not had the time to set the thicker timber. Jon pressed his palm to the wood that had been oiled and then neglected. He could smell the home of his boyhood through it. Wet stone, the faint ghost of old smoke, oat porridge, dogs. Griff, Duck murmured. Jon stepped back. Ram, he said. and the men who had carried the spare mast section all this way with curses that were becoming ritual swung it forward. And on the third blow the gate gave, and on the fourth it yawned inward, and the men were through, and the yard inside bloomed with sound as if the earth had decided to be a bell. There were perhaps 36 men within, Stormlanders by their look. Fair hair under wet helms and the faces of men whose fathers had taught them to hang little gods of driftwood at their doors. They chose quickly. A few raised weapons and shouted thinly. Most let those weapons fall with a clatter that sounded like relief. Duck took a man's sword from his hand with the delicacy of a lover moving hair from a brow. "No need," he said kindly. "We're all tired of serving boys who don't know what they want." "You serve one," the man said. Duck shrugged. "I serve learning. The lad learns." John crossed the yard as the few cries were stamped down and the gate barred from within. He mounted the steps to the great hall and paused in the doorway. The rushes had been changed badly. The tapestries hung limp and dull with damp. They deserved a sun that would never find them here. A dog raised its head from under a bench and thumped its tail twice and went back to sleep, as if it knew the true nature of victory and loss better than men did. John put his hand on the doorpost. There, under his palm, a notch where a boy had once thought to be tall enough to carve his initials and had failed, the mark too low and too ragged. He closed his eyes for an instant and then opened them because ghosts were not for this hour, no matter how they pressed. Aegon stepped to his side. He looked not at John but at the hall. Something changed in him then, something that did not happen when he learned to parry properly or to place a campfire where it would smoke less and damp. He made a shape with his shoulders and head that said the space answered some question he had been asking for years. "This," he said very quietly, "smells like I always thought my life would smell." John let out a sound that might have been a laugh and might have been the thing that comes when a chest is too full of water and chooses to be air again. "Welcome home," he said. Then, more briskly, because he could not survive the luxury of feeling, "Halden, the proclamations, Lemore, the September duck, the yard, the men, the cellar, the houndsman who hid in the kitchen and is now pretending he was there to keep the fire from going out," Duck said. Aegon walked forward. At the dais he stopped and put his hand upon the chair that had been Jon's father's and would never be Jon's again. He did not sit. He closed his eyes and took in a long breath, and when he opened them he looked first at Harry Strickland. "We will hold here," the boy said. The prince, Jon corrected himself because the word felt right in the mouth now, tasted of iron and difficult years. "Send riders to the weeping town for bread and salted fish. Send a ring farther. I want every petty knight and hedgerow lord in 10 miles to receive a letter that uses his name correctly and tells him who I am and where he can find me. I am the son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Elia of Dorne. I would have no man hear it secondhand from a man who sells wine by the skin. We must be careful whose ears we ring," Strickland said. "Renly Baratheon holds the Stormlands and the Reach in his pocket. He will not suffer this." "Renly is not king," Aegon said. His voice did not rise. "He plays at it with cloth of gold and green roses. Stannis will not suffer him either. While they argue over their father's chair, I mean to sit my own." "Storm's End," Jon said, before Strickland could find a more elaborate way to say the same caution. He looked past the boy at the empty seat, the damp tapestries that showed griffins that could not fly now if they wished to, their wings soaked. "You want Storm's End." Aegon looked at him then, and Jon saw both the child and the steel mask the child would wear as his face for the rest of his life. "Yes, you cannot take it by storm," Strickland said almost gently, as if instructing a cousin. "Some castles are songs that end only with surrender or starvation." "Songs end too," Aegon said. He glanced at Halden. "You told me that in the library at Volin Nerys. No matter how they love them, the singers always have to choose a final note. Storm's End will choose." "Your Grace," Halden said, and the title fit now, held by the rain in the walls and the dog that sighed under the bench. "We should consult maps. The marches, allies. We are early." 2 years early, Jon thought, not without satisfaction. Varys's last raven had come like a whisper in the dark. like the ghost of a hand pressing Jon's shoulder as if to say the time is now. Robert dead, the hand in chains, the lion's cub on the throne gnawing at meat he could not digest, the stag brothers splitting antlers on Dragonstone and at Bitterbridge, a river running too swift for men to ford. He had made the right choice, the only right thing he had done in years. They were not sneaking ashore to catch the realm napping. They were walking into a tent where men were already fighting over a crown and setting theirs upon the table. Maps, Aegon agreed. Then Duck, bring me the basin and the lie. Duck blinked, then grinned as if someone had told a particularly dirty joke. Aye, he said and went. Aegon turned to Jon in the hush that fall. Lord, I have worn this hair for too long, he said, to hide from fishwives and tavern shutters. If I mean to be believed, I must begin with the part of my face that is mine by blood. It will mark you, Jon said. He felt nothing in his tone. He had no energy left for argument that was mostly performance. In every window, every scrying, every story, the Stormlands will tell itself a new tale. Let them, Aegon said. Better a tale that begins with a true face than one that ends with a lie. Duck returned with the basin and a jug that smoked faintly in the chill, and a comb with a dozen teeth and a nervous-looking boy whose job, evidently, was to hold a cloth and not drop it. Aegon seated himself on a low stool rather than in the high seat that loomed at his back. He bent his head. Duck poured a careful stream. The dye ran like smoke, black into brown into a grayness that bled at the edges of the water until it looked like storm cloud in a bowl. Under it the pale stubble of silver came free, then the longer hair beneath. Aegon made no sound as the lie bit his scalp. His jaw tightened once and then smoothed. Lemore came with a hand and a cloth to keep the sting from his eyes. When the water was changed a third time and the last strands teased clean, Aegon raised his head. The hall took a breath. The boy in the doorway whispered something that might have been a prayer. Even Strickland's mouth softened in recognition of a story told well. The hair was not the gleaming coin red of his father's. It had his own shade of moonlit wheat with a sheen of snow to it, as if summer and winter had reached compromise. You will leave it like that? Jon said. I will, Aegon answered. The dragon is not always black and red. Sometimes it is the color of its own choosing. Jon thought of Rhaegar then, involuntarily, the tilt of his head under torchlight, the way the prince had looked at things as if they had deeper names under the names men used. He swallowed. It will do, he said roughly. Halden, the letters. We begin with houses whose men still spit when they say Baratheon, and then those whose men have no reason to spit at all because they already swallowed long ago when my father's banners fell. Wild of Rainhouse, Morrigan of Crow's Nest, Fell of Fellwood. Staidman of Broad Archcairn of Nightsong has a pride that might be coaxed if it is flattered correctly. Swan will watch and weigh and count. Tarth will listen to honor even in a storm, but send none to storm's end yet. The garrison there is more barometer than friend. And Dorne? Aegon asked very slightly. That was the other ghost at this long table. Sunspear will hear whatever song they most wish to hear if it is sung in the right key. I have my mother's name to offer and a life that is the fruit of their grief. Dorne hears and remembers, Halden murmured. But Doran Martell moves when he has moved 7 times already in his head. Send, yes. Promise carefully. Ask less than we want and more than we need. Right, Halden, Aegon said. Tell Doran Martell that Elias' son holds a Stormland seat and means to hold another. Tell him I would bind the friendships that should never have broken. Tell him that if I live to sit a throne, the South will not be wasted to feed a lion's cub. Outside, the rain slackened. The light gentled from iron to pewter. In that brief lessening there came a sound like a door opened in a far corridor. Hooves on wet stone in a cautious rhythm. Jon and Duck shared a look. Duck was moving before Jon could speak, and then Jon moved too, and the yard lit again with the small crisis of expectation. A rider ducked under the gate, cloak clotted with rain. He had the look of a man who had not slept in a day and had learned to sleep badly for a year. Who comes? Duck barked. Pell of Mistwood, the rider said. sliding from his horse with dignity even as his boots slid. "Lord Fell's man, I smell the truth of rumors on the road. I came faster than my captain would have liked." He lifted his head and saw the boy at the dais and made the smallest of bows, born of caution and of all the stories he had been told at his mother's knee. "They said the dragon had washed ashore." "The dragon walked," Aegon said. "But yes." Pell studied him the way a mason studies a line he is not sure is straight enough to bear weight. "Lord Fell remembers the day your grandfather burned his father and does not like that memory. But he remembers other days too, when his granaries were full and the seaholds paid their taxes on time and fewer ravens carried bad news. Lord Fell is not home. He rides with Lord Renly and claps when Lord Renly says witty things. But Mistwood keeps its own counsel when the rain is heavy." Jon felt his mouth pull into something that was not precisely a smile. "Will Mistwood counsel that the world is changing again?" Pell looked at Aegon as if measuring his height against the doorframe. "Mistwood counsels that if a prince eats the bread and salt of the house and speaks his grandfather's words without flinching, there might be a night where men drink less and listen more. If you are not who you say, we will hang you by your hair from a gallows that has seen better men. We are not afraid of sinning by accident in the Stormlands. We sin because the weather makes us." Aegon stepped down from the dais. He crossed the hall, his boots making no sound on damp rushes, and stood before Pell of Mistwood. "I am the son of Rhaegar Targaryen," he said. He did not add his mother's name this time. He did not add titles he did not yet hold. He held out his hand. Pell looked at it, looked at his face, and then put his hand in the boy's. Some of the room let out a breath. Some of it held it anew. "We have a roof," Aegon said, and he spoke loud enough for the room to hear and for the dog under the bench to open an eye. "We have bread coming. We have swords enough to hold what we have taken and banners enough to frighten those who watch banners instead of men. We will need more than that. We will need men who have heard worse songs than mine and choose mine anyway. Tell Lord Fell that I will walk into Mistwood with no helmet on my head and sit at his table and let him weigh my skull with his gaze. Tell him I am early, that all I am in these weeks is ear and hand and patience." Pell swallowed as if to clear his throat of something other than water. "I will tell him," he said, and then in a lower tone meant only for Aegon and Jon and the men nearest. "Bitterbridge swims in banners. The Reach feeds Lord Renly and the Stormlands follow him like boys follow a dog with a bright ribbon tied to its tail. But there is a bitterness under the jokes. They do not like Stannis, and Stannis does not like them, and they know they are children playing in their father's closet. If you bring a man in a true shirt into that room, they will recognize the shape even if they do not like the color. We must move before songs become oaths," Jon said. "Storms end." Pell's eyes went briefly wider. "You would knock at those doors while Renly sits his pretty throne of wood on green grass?" "We would," Aegon said. He did not glance to Jon for approval. Jon thought it was both foolish and necessary. "If I knock and they will not open, I will camp under their shadow until shadows lengthen. I will feast my men on humility and patience until the garrison feels its own stomach gnaw." "And the lion in the capital?" Pell said, a little wonderingly. "And the wolves in the north?" "You would make your first stand in the House of Storms." "I was born in storms," Aegon said. "All my life men have held cloth over my head and told me not to get wet. I am tired of breathing other men's air." The rider stood as men stand when they have not slept and decide to learn what waking might be for. He bowed again deeper. "I'll ride," he said, and turned without waiting for dismissal. When the gate shuttered closed behind him and the sound of hooves slid down the hill and away, the hall seemed at once emptier and brighter. Halden's quill scratched. Lamore's lips moved in prayer or in calculation of provisions or both. Duck held the basin with hair-dark water and looked disappointed at the lack of immediate stabbing required. Strickland pinched the bridge of his nose as if to hold inside his skull the last of the East and its safe contracts. Jon moved to the window slit. Rain silvered the yard. Beyond the yard the hill fell away into trees, and beyond the trees the sea lay in hammered gray, forgetting that it had ever been anything else. "Varys will know within a day," he said. Then he has earned his reputation, Aegon said. Let him send the news to every bedchamber where men make plans they pretend are prayers. Jon turned. The boy's hair had dried into its own pale color. He was a prince now in more than declaration. There was a rightness in the hall. The way a painting you had hung crooked your whole life suddenly found the nail it needed and settled. Jon felt fear then, sudden and enormous and private. It was the fear a man feels when the thing he has waited to begin finally begins, and he realizes that the waiting had been its own safety. "You will sleep here tonight," he said, "in the chamber that was mine before I learned how many kinds of cold there are in the world. You will wake early. The weather will give us a window. We will march at noon." "To Storm's End," Aegon said. He sounded as if he were reciting a love poem he had taught himself from memory. Each word careful, none wasted. "To Storm's End," Jon agreed. He thought, in a place of him he no longer visited willingly, of a tent along the Green Fork long ago and a laugh like silver coins, and a harp string that had snapped and drawn blood when it broke. And to whatever waits between. They rose in the gray before the dawn. The rain stopped as if a hand had been lifted. The air smelled of wet stone, and the green that comes after weather has beaten the pride out of a forest and left it humbled and shining. Men ate what they could force down. The letters went out with riders whose instructions had as many ifs as a priest's sermon. If you see Lord Stedman's men first, say this. If the Morrigens have their aunt's temper, say that. If you find too many watchful eyes, say nothing at all and drink and come home. Aegon stood in the yard and drew breath after measured breath and looked at the men who would march behind him. They were not the glittering lines of a tourney. They were migrants from a dozen wars who had chosen this one because it had in it a boy who listened when men spoke and then did not betray the listening. Jon watched the faces. He knew what a man looks like when he has decided to die for a thing and learned to be ashamed of that decision in the same instant. He saw less of that than he had feared. He saw the other kind of look, the one that says a man will be greedy for small moments if he cannot have large ones. The food hot, the bed dry, the word "Your Grace" not soured on the tongue. "Form," Duck called. He swung into his saddle, big in a way that made horses look like smaller horses. "Left, you sons of seal wives. Save your right for the gods." The road to Storm's End was a thread of stone patched again and again by the hands of men who understood that certain duties exist even when the lord to whom they are owed changes his sigil. It crested ridges and fell into hollows where water crouched and then crossed open stretches where the wind ran free and chased itself like dogs. They moved like a creature with 100 legs and one mind. Aegon rode near the front, a little behind Jon, where a prince should ride when he means to learn rather than to be seen. They passed a farmhouse half collapsed, its roof thrown up in a posture of surrender. The old man on the step watched them pass and spat once and 3 times in quick succession, as if covering 3 chances at luck or 3 gods who might notice. Aegon lifted a hand to him, and the man lifted his pipe slightly in answer, and it was more than a bow. At a bend where the road changed its mind about being a road and chose to be a long flat stone because it was simply easier in rain, a party of 4 riders came from the trees and drew up short with the shock of men who have meant only to travel and found themselves in a story. The foremost wore the yellow of the wilds with its black rain of drops. His face held the easy expectation of a man who had been told from birth that the world would not dare surprise him too much and was now testing the theorem. "Who goes?" he called, the formula like a rope he threw across the gap between them. "A prince and his ghosts," Jon said before Aegon could shape a more poetic thing. "And men who keep their word." "Names?" the man in wild yellow said, a little nettled by the answer that did not require him to bridle. "If I am to take a message back to Rainhouse, I must have names to carry in my teeth." "Aegon," said the boy simply. He shifted his horse forward 2 steps and the light took his hair and made it a thing someone had painted, wanting to be caught. "Aegon Targaryen, the name your grandsires learned to say with either laughter or fear, depending on which part of the long song they liked best. And this," he tipped his chin toward Jon, "is Jon Connington, once of this land and still made of its stone, the wild heir or cousin." He had that look, blanched purely and then blushed, not from embarrassment but from the sudden quickening of blood in a story. "My lord," he said, and to Aegon he made a movement that could be bow or salute. The sea told us a rumor. I didn't think she would tell the truth. She lies when the moon is full. She lies when men ask her the wrong questions, Aegon said. Your lord. At home, the wild man said. We have held our island and our temper while Lord Renly plays king and Lord Stannis plays judge. We are tired of games. Aegon smiled with just the front of his mouth. So am I. Ride with us, Jon said, cutting cleanly so that no man had room to be charmed into a vow he had not intended to make. See what kind of prince this is when rain is not striking his face theatrically. Decide at Storm's End if your lord will take his bread with us or with men who have forgotten how to chew without an audience. The wild man swallowed his first answer and nodded his second. I will, he said. His men fell in at the flank, wary but not hostile. They smelled of salt and wool and the thin pride of islanders. At noon the clouds broke for the space of 20 heartbeats. Sun spilled like honey over everything that had been iron and pewter all morning. In that light, sudden and soft, Storm's End appeared, not as a shape yet but as a certainty on the horizon. An immense idea above a long arm of land that reached into the sea like a dare. Jon found his breath again as if he had not known he'd been holding it for 20 years. Duck whistled between teeth as if that would flatter the weather into showing more of itself. Aegon leaned forward in the saddle and then checked himself and sat back because a prince does not hunch. Do you see it? He asked, not trusting his eyes. Or do men of the Stormlands pretend to see it so they can talk about it and make it more theirs? I see it, Jon said. I felt it as a boy in my knees. Buildings can be felt before they can be understood. Storm's End is the weight of a hand on the back of your neck when you kneel. It says you will rise when it wishes. We will make it wish, Aegon said. There's a small matter of food, Halden observed mildly, and of not having our throats cut in our sleep by men who swear to a stag. But yes, we will see about wishing. They made camp on a low heath where the gorse grew thick and the wind came with a taste of salt that was almost sweet. Men set lines between stakes and hung damp cloaks in a brief optimism. Fires fought the damp and then settled to burn sullenly. Letters were sent again, this time to the garrison captain at Storm's End, to the few lords bold and rash enough to be counted and the many cautious enough to be captured with courtesy. Aegon ate from a wooden bowl and listened to the grumbles about the fatness of the salt pork and then listened to the jokes a moment later about the same fatness. He laughed in the right place, not as strategy but because he had learned to let his face receive the world as well as his mind. After, when the camp grew quiet and the wind stitched its thread through the grass and the fire took on the steady, sleepy respiration of a thing soon to become ash, Jon went to stand beside him on the slight rise of ground from which men and fires and hastily pitched tents looked like the floor of a long, low hall. Storm's End was a darker block against the dark in the distance. It had no lights. It had no need to brag. You stepped forward today, Jon said, keeping his voice low enough that it belonged to the night and not to the men. I am tired of stepping backward, Aegon said. It makes me a kind of dizzy. You are very young, Jon said. I keep telling myself that. It is not a sentence with just one meaning. Aegon turned his head, not enough to make the move theatrical. You mean I am young enough to be forgiven and young enough to be destroyed? Yes, Jon said. He did not realize until he spoke that he had been thinking the word Rhaegar for 10 minutes without speaking it. He made his mouth say the boy's name instead. Aegon, I am not good with prayers. The seven never answered me when I asked them for reasonable things. But if I had one to say now, it would be, let the walls of Storm's End be the first hard thing that breaks against him and not the last soft thing. Aegon was quiet for a time. The wind laid his pale hair along his skull in neat lines and then lifted it again with a lover's hand. When I was little, he said, Illyrio told me stories about this place as if I would be born out of them when I was big enough. It sounded like a coin falling forever in a well and never quite reaching the water. I thought if I ever saw it with my eyes I would be finished, that there would be no more wanting. But I think there will be more wanting. All my life I have wanted one thing. That is not how a man lives. A man must divide his wanting so it does not break him. Then divide it, Jon said. Want 100 small things. Want the right words. Want the right sleep. Want the weather to be only half against us. Do you want me to be king? Aegon asked very simply. He asked it the way a son asks his father if the fish he caught is big enough to be worth cleaning. Jon looked at the block of Storm's End and then at the boy who had stepped off a boat and turned into something other than a boy in the space of a morning. He felt the old wound open along its old lines, and this time it bled a little less. Yes, he said. I want you to be king enough to forgive me if I make you cruel by accident. Aegon's mouth made a shape that was not a smile and not its opposite. Then forgive me if I make you hope by accident. They stood there a while and said nothing the wind needed to carry anywhere. When they went to their tents, it was with the knowledge that morning would come even if men did not deserve it. Beyond them, on that arm of land that had broken storms for centuries, a garrison hardened its bread and counted its arrows and practiced looking bored. In the darkness between, the Stormlands waited with the patience it had learned from weather. The patience of a thing that knows it will outlast men and their blue eyes and their dyed hair, and that yet, for a time, will yield to the story that is walking toward its gate. The dawn came up in a gauze of pearl and smoke, and the camp moved like something in a dream. Men spoke in the undertones of those who have learned that voices carry farther in damp air. The fires were coals the color of old cherries. A gull took the wind at a slant and hung there like an omen that could not make up its mind. The smell of boiled barley and bacon fat ran between lines as a sort of crude benediction. In the east, the sea had put on a different face. Less iron, more hammered pewter with lines of quicksilver where the first light broke upon waves that did not think themselves waves yet. Jon buckled his sword belt and listened to the leather creak. The sound recalled mornings here long ago, when the world had been smaller because he had been smaller within it, and every ridge had held a chance for improvement if he could run it faster than yesterday. He watched Aegon eat carefully, as if the boy would drop some clue about the day into his porridge. There was nothing to see but a measured hand and a mouth that did not dramatize its hunger or disdain the food that could be had. 2 riders for the gate, Duck said when the last of the ration pots came off the fire. His beard had collected dew as if he had slept with his head under a hedge. Your call as to which faces we show first. Not mine, Aegon said. Jon nodded. Nor mine, he answered. They will see me soon enough and decide whole chapters from a single glance. Halden, choose your words for them before they ride, lest the rain wash the right ones from their tongues. It is a relief to advise men with open ears, Halden said. He folded a letter and pushed it into the hands of a lean fellow from Myr who had sold his birth city's vowels years ago for steadier pay. Say what is written and then let your face say you mean it. We ask for talk above the salt. We offer bread and the truth of a name spoken cleanly. The 2 riders set out at an even pace. The land ran up into low shoulders of rock and gorse and then ran down again toward the long strip of causeway that joined Storm's End's arm of land to the body of the Stormlands like a tendon. The fortress grew as they rode. Here a line that at first seemed cloud and then clarified into the upper edge of a curtain wall. There a suggestion of towers that did not wish to declare their height until they could seize a man's breath with the act. Storm's End did not glitter. It absorbed light and made it into weight. Aegon watched that approach as other men watch a woman walking toward them when every coin in their pockets is counterfeit and they hope she will kiss them before counting. He said nothing. Jon took from that silence both strength and worry. The boy was learning his own economy. Maris came to the camp at mid-morning with 2 of her sons and baskets on their backs, and a look that said she accepted the weather and men as they came because she had learned long ago that refusing them gained nothing. The boys had the salt-rough hands of the shore and the unguarded stares of those who have not yet been laughed into caution. They had brought eels already gutted and coiled like dark ropes, hard loaves wrapped in cloth so old its threads had the memory of many bakings in them, onions that had grown misshapen in a season that had changed its mind too many times. We smelled your fires, Maris said, and we heard how your men didn't put hands on any girls they weren't married to last night. It is a new kind of army that can manage that with coin in their pockets. It is an old kind, Aegon said. He had come down from the small rise without Jon noting the moment he chose to move. The kind that knows discipline eats better than desire. She studied him in daylight that had no rain in it for the moment. Her gaze passed over the hair that would tell half the Stormlands a story it did not intend to hear. "You've washed," she said. "I have," he answered. "About time," she said. "A prince should not smell of lice unless he's already in bed." She left him to the baskets after that, as if she did not care whether he made something of her remark. Jon watched the boy hide a smile poorly and decided that was for the good. A prince who learned to be pleased by the right jokes would survive men who made worse ones. The first rider came back near noon, his horse blowing hard, wet to the knees from having crossed the final shallow where the causeway stones vanished under a pane of water thinner than it looked. The man swung down and cursed without drama, and then made himself presentable as if the making were part of his oath. "They made us speak to the portcullis," he said. The captain kept to shadow and choked the gate with his silence. He has a maester who reads like a man nagged by his wife. They let the letter in on a string so it wouldn't catch the bad luck of our hands. They made much of bread and salt, he added, with a touch of the soldier's mockery for gentler protocols that could not stop a spear when it came with force, and then took neither with us. "Names?" Halden asked. "None given," the rider said. "Men on the parapet with no badges bright enough to brag." The captain had a Stormlands voice, if that is any comfort. He spoke as if he'd chewed pine pitch in winter. He asked who sent us, and I said the name, and his silence changed shape. "That is all I can say for certain." "Does the silence of a man change shape?" Duck said, amused gently. "Yes," Jon said. He took the letter the rider gave him, Halden's neat hand on it like the rails of a garden bed keeping wild out, and laid it flat on a plate to dry. What you do not say makes a different kind of room around you when you know a new thing and are taking care not to show it. Aegon stood with his hands behind his back the way Halden had taught him to stand when he was small and weaned to thinking. "Will he open?" "Not today," Jon said. "Today he will count the arrows again and decide how much quiet costs his men before winter, if he would spend it on our account. He will ask himself what his lord would want and then ask himself if his lord is in a position to want anything at all. He will decide that whatever he decides had better be hidden in the kind of paper that folds small under a mattress." "Who is his lord?" the boy asked, looking toward those dark walls that had been a nation's argument at least twice within living memory. "His mouth says the king on the Iron Throne is his lord," Halden said mildly. "His heart may say Lord Renly because the grass is greener where the girls dance. His conscience, if he keeps one, remembers the day Stannis Baratheon taught him how to stack stones as if the sea were a debtor who must be made to pay. And if he is old enough, he remembers the last siege and the man with the onions who saved them all. That makes his lord the shape of a promise he cannot put a name to yet." Aegon's eyes went briefly alight at the mention of the Onion Man. There were stories about Davos Seaworth in the east, told by sailors who prized a trick done on a winter's sea more than 1,000 banners flown smartly on land. "Threats? Only the weather," the rider said. "And the way the men on the walls watched us the way crows watch men who sleep beneath them too long." In the afternoon other riders returned, not from the fortress but from the world beyond it. The wild man's cousin had a face the color of unpolished oak with patches gone lighter where the sun had caught him too strongly in youth. He wore his pride where men would see it and not be able to take it from him. He rode with 2 men from Fellwood who had taught their horses to keep their hooves quiet on stone, a trick learned from their fathers and used to varying degrees of honesty depending on who their fathers had been. With them came a boy from Tarth who must have been sent by Selwyn the Evenstar's steward, for he could not keep from staring at Aegon as if the young prince were a knight in a story come off of a page to move among men. He had a letter in a blue waxed packet and a face that could not lie if he wished to. Jon broke the seal. Selwyn Tarth wrote in a hand as precise as hinges, and said nothing that could not be read by the man who carried the letters in his satchel for the day. Yet there was courtesy in the choice of words, the kind that bows without getting its knee wet. "Lord Selwyn says honor is a chair that must be sat in every day or else it decides it has other rooms to live in," Aegon said after Jon read the letter twice. He says his lands feed on the sea and on stubbornness. He says the Tyrells will want his daughter in their silks, and he prefers his daughter in her own skin. Jon flicked his eyes up at the boy from Tarth, who blushed to the roots of his hair, and then remembered that he had not been asked to carry messages about daughters, and that his lord's daughter would likely peel his skin if she knew he had blushed on her account. It took an effort for Jon to keep his expression plain. He had seen Brienne of Tarth twice, once from a distance when Renly had played at being a king under green boughs, and once on a road where she had walked alone with a look that made the road get out of her way. She would break a fine bright sword before letting it break her. The world made too few of her kind, and most men did not know what to do when they met one. Selwyn would be courted without being compromised, Haldon murmured. He will not say yes to any man's war until he has counted the holes the sea makes in his walls in winter and decided which gaps he can afford. Still, there is kindness in the ink. He remembers Rhaegar as a song that did not hurt his ears. Before evening, men from Nightsong came, not in force but with the easy confidence of those who knew their lord's pride would make itself felt in the room whether his body was present or not. They wore the Karen nightingales at their throats, as if to remind even their own necks where they belonged. The elder of the two had a scar where a blade had put a thought across his face when he was 19 and full of an older man's wine. He was too tired now for wine and had learned to drink hunger instead. Lord Karen says he does not bandy with boys, the elder said. But the nights are long and the words can go with them, and if a prince came to his gate and asked to stand by his fire, the gate would not break from the weight of his courtesy. If a prince stood in his hall and took his bread and told him he may have been born early but he had not come early to talk, Lord Karen might sit and hear him until the fire went low. Lord Karen adds that he loved Lord Renly, and that men get confused when they do two kinds of loving at once. Aegon's face did not change. If anything, the young lines of it made a kind of room for what he heard to echo in. What if I said I have come to tell him grief changes its shape when it is looked at honestly? Then he would say a boy should not know to speak like that, the man said. And then he would say he hated your grandfather and your father differently, and he has forgiven neither of them. He glanced a little oddly at Jon. And he would say the Griffins flew poorly under King Robert and maybe under kings before him, and that a man can break 2 vows and still know how to keep a third if the third is dear enough. I will go to Nightsong, Aegon said, and Jon thought of the map again, always the map, the roads to be ridden and the time to be found like coins in out-of-season coats. But first I will sit under Storm's End. They put up a banner then for the first time, at the angle of the camp where the wind could find it and make work for itself. It was not the 3-headed red of the old dragon, not yet. Haldon had counseled and Jon had agreed. The Stormlands had pricked their fingers on enough red banners to be wary of that color's simple insistence. Aegon's standard for that afternoon was a pale field like the light upon the sea when the sun is shy, with a narrow dragon inked in dark along the cloth's lower quarter, coiled and watching, not roaring. It made men look twice. The first glance did not alarm. The second confirmed a suspicion that raised hair on forearms and made certain old men remove their caps. Toward dusk, the second of the 2 envoys to the gate returned. His horse's left foreleg looked wrong. The rider moved at a pace that preserved a life rather than a schedule. Jon went to him himself because that was what a man did when men bled on his behalf for small results. They answered, the rider said when he swallowed and could speak. Captain at the gate again. He called himself no noble thing. He spoke like a man who had learned to let his words be stones he could lift later if need be. He said, "Tell the boy the House of Storms lets in no dragons. Tell him the last time a dragon came here, it left its bones on the steps for the sea to chew. Tell him we feed on justice in this house and not on song. Tell him if he is who he says he is, he would have sent a letter with a feather from a bird we have heard of, not from a ship that smells of liss." He said all that and never raised his voice. I told him your letter had the seal you said it would have, and he said seals melt and men lie. And then, Aegon asked. And then he said, the rider went on carefully, that boys who wish to prove they are men should do so by standing in the rain, and that we had stood in the rain too long for his conscience. They brought me in for a moment so a maester could say whether my horse had lame's plague. He did not. They gave me a heel of barley bread and a skin with a mouthful of cider in it, and then pushed me out again as if they had not touched me, for fear the touch would be seen. Jon exhaled. "Good captain," he said. "Bad news, but given with an honest hand." He looked to Aegon. "He means to keep the silence until Lord Renly arrives to tell him how to break it. Or until Stannis works up a plan to answer his pride in old coin. We have this long and no longer." Aegon stood a little while after that with his hands behind his back and the wind working the pale hair toward his nape and then away again. Lights came up in the camp as a line of low sunrise. Downwind the sea put its cold fingers under the tent edges and lifted them and set them back down like someone reminding a sleeper that morning comes. When Aegon finally moved, it was without flourish. "Tomorrow," he said, "I will walk to that gate myself and ask their captain to look at me. A man must have eyes, and if he has eyes he owes them labor." Harry Strickland's mouth made a worried line that looked more like habit than feeling. "You will not be shot for the sport of it, your grace," he said gently, the grace a habit now among more men than Haldon and Jon. Men in Storm's End have sense left to them like old bread. But there is danger in letting their walls feel taller for having kept a prince outside. They will talk of the one they turned away, and the talking will comfort them. "I am not comforted by other men's comfort," Aegon said. He smiled then, with the odd quickness that came to him sometimes and made him briefly a boy again. "It is a flaw, I'm told. Duck says so often." "I say you are a cold bowl of gruel with too much salt," Duck said. "I say I am not redressing the weather this night. I say if you go to a gate with a bow showing, you should show a better bow. Then we will take 5 men and the right words," Jon said, and he touched the hilt of his sword for the reassurance of touch rather than from any intention. "And we will see which shape their silence becomes when a boy's face is its mirror." That night the sea spoke at a lower register. The wind swung just enough to bring up from the south the smell of far-off rains that would not touch the Stormlands by morning. Men slept. Men woke. A horse screamed once in dream. The sky leaned down and threw needles of cold into the hours like a miser spending coin he had been forced to spend. Jon lay on his side and counted breaths until the count itself made him drowsy. When sleep took him, it did so without kindness. He dreamed of a tent where a harp had been tuned too high, and of a boy with hair like frost standing in a doorway with an expression that was not yet grief and already wider than hope. They went at first light. The 5 were chosen without drama. Duck and Haldon because they were the right halves of 2 different loyalties. Lemore because sometimes the sight of a septa made hard men recall that their grandmothers were better than they. Jon because nothing could be otherwise, and Aegon because that had been the point all along. They rode without banners and with their cloaks hooded against a wind that worried more than it bit. The land narrowed. The causeway showed itself more plainly at that hour. Flat stones set and reset across centuries by hands that had learned to work under orders and in storms. At the far end, the great drum of Storm's End rose like a thing the gods had made in a mood and left for men to argue about. The underworks of the gate showed their cunning. The angles that would let oil fall and water run, and the spaces that would be deadly if a man did not know their proportions. There was no flaunting of strength in the stone. It was something else, the pure economy of it. The refusal to budge. "Stop there," a voice called, not loud, not sharp, merely with the authority of a man who knows what happens in every square foot of earth under his care and wishes it to happen at the times he chooses. Men appeared along the wall walk as if they had risen from the stone. Arrows were not knocked, but hands rested close. The captain at the gate made himself half seen again in the shadow of the murder hole. His helm was the unkind shape the Stormlands preferred. Round enough to turn a blow, with a nose bar that made poetry unnecessary. "State your business." Aegon had taken down his hood at 50 paces and let the wind do its part. He did not call up. That would have been theater. He lifted his face to the shadow and spoke as if the man in it were at his elbow. "My business is the truth of my name," he said. "I am Aegon Targaryen, son of Prince Rhaegar and Princess Elia. I am early to my own life. I have come to ask you to open your gate for bread and talk and witness. I will come in without my sword. I will eat what you eat. You may keep your bow on your lap and your hand upon it while we speak. I ask only that you look upon me without the stone between us and decide whether you will have me as an enemy or a guest." The captain was silent a time. Somewhere on the wall a gull called twice and was answered by its mate. Halden sat his horse as if he were a carved thing laid on a noble's bier after a life of reading. Duck scratched the scar at the corner of his mouth and watched the murder hole the way a farmer watches a sky that cannot decide which weather it brings. "Names are cheap," the captain said at last. "Storm's End was built to keep out names and let in men. I will have you sworn." "I will be sworn," Aegon said. The captain's silence shifted again, and now Jon could feel the ache in his jaw where his teeth met. He had been a boy here once and learned that the guards are more likely to trust a man who does not grimace when wine finds his old scars. He had won a wager on how long he could stand with his palms open under a sudden fall of sleet in February. The men on the wall remembered fools like that with an odd fondness. The portcullis rose by inches. Each clank accounted cost. The wooden gate behind drew back. The mouth of Storm's End opened and showed a throat of stone polished by generations of rain and fear. The captain came forward only as far as the shadow. He had a face as ordinary as work. If he had been somebody's uncle, no songs would have been wasted on him, but his nephews would not have been cheated at cards in any tavern where he sat. Hammered iron ringed his arms. His eyes were the gray the sea can be when it is tired of choosing moods. "Dismount," he said. "Leave your steel." Aegon slid down and handed Jon his sword without looking away from the man. Lemore swung off and took Aegon's hand for a breath, as if to remind him that women had been more god to him than gods had been. Duck unslung his long knife and let it drop into the grass with the lack of ceremony men reserve for the things they respect and cannot deny. Halden had nothing to lay down but the little knife he used to coax stubborn vellum when it warped, and he laid it on the earth with care, as if it were a thing that might be hurt by falling. They went in together side by side. The gate swallowed them and made them briefly creatures of shadow. The smell inside was of old rain and newer men. The inner portcullis rose after a pause that told Jon a line of men had been judging how many archers could shoot a man where he stood if they chose to lower it fast. The yard within Storm's End opened like a pocket, deep and dark and echoing with the odd, soft sounds of a fortress at watch between wars. A dog put its forepaws up on a low wall and looked at them with speculative good nature. Beyond the yard there were doors big enough to swallow wagons and small enough to deny a single-man entrance. There were gutters that made their own language. The captain stopped just inside the yawning. "Bread," he said, "and salt." A younger man came with a tray. He had the unfurrowed brow of a fellow who had not yet had to decide between two wrongs in quick succession. He held the tray as if its weight were a riddle. The bread was brown and dense. The salt was in a cup of wood carved by someone who loved someone once and had wanted to make something that would outlast them both. Aegon broke the bread and put the pieces in his mouth without ceremony. He took a pinch of salt and touched it to his tongue, and the gesture was, for a breath, unarguably holy. Lemore did the same after him, as if sanctifying the ritual anew with each touch. Duck resisted the urge to comment. Jon put the salt to his tongue and tasted 100 mornings when he had stood where the wind could slap him and thought of a different life. "You have my guest right," the captain said. "Use it without wasting it." He turned his eyes to Jon. "My lord." "Castellan," Jon said. The man gave the small near smile of one who has not been called by his exact office often enough lately and appreciates the accuracy. "You know what we keep here," he said to Aegon then. "Old stones, old oaths, a talent for outlasting men who come to tell us what these stones and oaths should turn into next. The last time the world told us which king to prefer, we preferred famine. It made us bitter for a generation and sharper for 2 days. Why do you knock at this gate now and not at some sweeter door?" "Because sweet doors lead into rooms where men have tripped on carpets," Aegon said. "I want a floor that knows what it is." "Words," the captain said. "You can move them around quickly. Who taught you to do that? The man behind you with the scholar's quill? The Sellsword with the appetite? The griffin with the stone in his chest where a boy's heart used to be. Aegon did not turn his head. He took the insult and laid it down where it would not bruise. I was taught by need, he said, and by men who wanted me to be the thing I said I was when I laid down to sleep. I can tell you what I want. A kingdom with fewer lies. A throne that does not spill children from its lap. I can tell you what I do not want. To be comfort for men poorer than me while I spend their rage on my glory. I can tell you I will bleed for the Stormlands before I ask them to bleed for me, and that the first of my blood I will give is here and now. He did not reach for a knife. He raised his hand and bit the heel of it until blood came up as a ruby, and then smeared it in a slow line upon the stone of the gate's inner jaw. The gesture had no place in any legal understanding of how castles are opened or men are crowned. It had a place in men's chests where old stories live under the newer ones and mutter that they are hungrier. Now you have my blood, Aegon said simply. It makes us kin in a way ink cannot. You can throw it away with a bucket when you wash this gate in the morning, or you can let it dry there and have to explain to every boy who asks what a prince's blood looked like on a gray day. The captain's eyes, which had been tired in the way men's eyes get when they have been awake to other men's fear too long and too often, changed not in color but in use. He lifted his hand and did not scratch his cheek. He looked at the smear of red and then back at the boy. He said, in a voice that had shed a layer, "You are like him." "Like who?" Aegon asked, and Jon's stomach clenched because names in this yard had been grenades in other hours. "Like Rhaegar," the captain said, and if he lied then he lied for a reason that was not a bad one. "In the mouth, not the hair. In the way of standing as if you will be steady even if the world forgets how to be. He stood there once, did you know? Not in the storm, not with his blood on the stone. Not with my men watching the ends of their arrows as if they were girls about to kiss. He stood there with a lute and played a thing that made the yard a church for a while. He took a breath that went down as if he had not expected it to be air. We will not open for you today. If you open tomorrow, Aegon said, I will still be here. If you open next week, I will bring bread. If you open not at all, I will leave the bread and the men who would eat it with you when winter makes more honesty of your stores. I did not come to pull down a house that has stood when kings behaved like weather. I came to ask you to stand with me once more, when kings have forgotten they are not weather. The captain's mouth tugged once. It was not a smile, and yet it warmed the air an inch. Go, he said, before tenderness makes me foolish. You have been seen. You will be seen again. It is worse for a man to be seen twice than once. They backed out with the awkward dignity men have when they are careful not to feed a lie. Outside the gate the wind found them eagerly, as if it had missed them dearly during those few minutes within stone. Duck wiped his palm along his breeches and then frowned as if he had not intended to reveal anything so personal as a brief touch of awe. Halden made a small noise that might have been the sound an old book makes when closed. Penrose? Jon asked when they had put the first curve of the causeway behind them, and the word tasted of speculation that wanted a face. Could be, Duck said. Sounded as if he had slept with his back straight for 40 years. Could be half a dozen of that kind. I've never met a Stormlander captain who didn't talk as if the sea had adopted him. Not Penrose, Halden murmured. Penrose hemmed more in his speech. As if he were always wearing a door, he wondered whether to close. He glanced to Aegon. He saw you. He saw us, the boy said. He saw what we were both ready to spend. He looked down at his hand, at the crescent mark his own teeth had left at the heel. I did not plan that. Good, Lemore said, speaking for the first time since the gate swallowed them. Plans make men forget to look hard enough. You looked. They were halfway back to camp when the first of the green banners came into view upon the western road. Not a forest of them, not a threat in exclamation points, just 3 or 4 moving with the steadiness of messengers who carry more silk than sense and yet have outridden men who would cut their silk to measure it. The Tyrell rose glowed because it had been tended. The men under it wore reach mail, polished to a vanity that had not yet learned how little the Stormlands admire such things. Renly's pickets, Duck said, not reaching for his knife because there was no knife at his hip and because if there had been it would not have been right to reach for it here. or Highgarden's eyes, which is the same thing in green. They met halfway between the two camps upon a strip of short grass where sheep had grazed in calmer hours. The Reachmen reined in with flourishes at which the wind laughed. Their captain, very young, very pretty in a way that time would temper rather than erase, raised a hand in greeting and then in caution, as if he had nearly greeted too warmly and remembered he was supposed to be afraid. "By whose leave do you sit your camp within sight of Storm's End?" he called. He had the fluting tone of a man who has been told since boyhood that his words will be repeated later. He burned with the pride of being a cousin too many times over to a queen who had not yet become one. "By the leave of the weather," Jon said, not bothering to call back because the space between them did not require it. "And by the leave of stones that do not resent being overlooked by a boy while they decide whether he is worth their trouble." He gestured toward Aegon. "By his leave, since you ask. If your lord is Lord Renly, tell him we have come early to a war he invented for himself. If your lord is Mace Tyrell, tell him his banners are very green and impress boys, and that we are not boys." The Reach captain's gaze slid past Jon as men's gazes have always slid past the useful to the interesting and caught on Aegon's hair with a little pleasurable pain at the eyes. "If you ask us to call you by a name that once frightened my grandfather," he said, "call yourself by it with the patience of a man who knows how far the wind carries such a sound. We have been told to look for pretenders and pretty tricks. We were told the Reach raised sons who knew wheat from chaff before harvest," Aegon said, his tone the even kindness of a physician who is about to cut a boil and does not wish the patient to think him cruel. "It would shame me to think your fathers lied." The young Reachman flushed and then saved himself from the worst of his own skin by laughing in the right place at his own expense. "You are quicker than you look," he said. "Lord Renly's court has been speaking of you for a day. Your ships smelled of liss. You smell of something else altogether. If you would deliver a message to my lord that will make him smile, I will carry it. If you would deliver one that will make him think, I will try to carry that too. Tell him I will not mock him in the grass or put him in a position where his men must fly from their own laughter," Aegon said. "Tell him I will camp and wait and ask his lords one by one whether they want to be men in their own houses or girls in his. Tell him I will walk into his camp with one sword if he invites me, and with no sword if he will speak under God's eye. Tell him that if he marries a rose he will smell sweet and stain easily, and that the world will want both from him and he will not like the price." The Reachman looked at him sharply then, the first sharpness that was not garnish. "You do not like him," he said. "I do not know him," Aegon answered. "That is different. I do not like the idea of a crown like a seat at a feast. If you convince me he is more serious than his laughter, I will like him instead of the idea. Tell him that too." "I will tell him," the Reachman said, and there was a small, bright honesty in his mouth that suggested he might. He spun his horse with a flourish too big for the day and rode on, his men following like bright fish behind a hook. When they were gone the air felt less crowded with opinions. Jon looked at Aegon. "You enjoyed that," he said, not accusing. "I enjoyed not being asked to hide," the boy said. "And I enjoyed not being the only one in the field who had to decide which of his own words he would keep." He sighed then, and the sigh was as old as he was, which could be older in some hours and younger in others. "I felt a door open in there," he added, glancing back toward Storm's End. "It did," Jon said. "It opened enough to see whether we would try to force it. We did not. We will live with that choice and see what kind of meal it makes for us." In the evening messengers multiplied the way clouds do when a farmer sets out to cut hay and thinks he has the weather cowed. Mistwood sent a second word with more caution in its lines, as if Lord Fell had considered what it would look like to sit at table with a dragon by his fire and counted the eyes that would watch his front door. Crow's Nest's answer had in it the proud peculiarities of the Morrigens, long sentences like plumes and a strand of bitterness older than any living man. Broad Arch's steward wrote in a near pastoral about floods in the spring and the necessity of cutting new channels every 3 years. Between the lines lay a question about coin and whether the prince who had brought Sellswords would pay them on time like a lord and not like a story. Aegon answered some himself. Halden guided his hand in the way that does not touch it. by saying which words the Stormlands trust and which they do not forgive easily, by reminding him that a lord who cuts his own meat in his hall will always award more credit to a prince who does not flinch at greasy fingers on a good day. Lemore added lines of grace the way a woman makes a stew, by instinct and with an eye to what will sit within a man and sustain him later. Jon signed his name to nothing he wrote. The Griffin had the sense not to try to make himself the story where he could be the line under it. Night came up like a tide. The wind shifted once more and came out of the east with a taste of rock, as if it had been licking the face of Dragonstone and brought a little of that dragon shape with it between its teeth. Men spoke of it as men speak of the weather when they mean something else. Stannis Baratheon, and the Red Woman they said he kept like a sword wrapped in cloth, and the way his name sounded when spoken by men who liked law better than laughter. Duck told a story, at first joke and then true, about a night on the disputed lands when a priest of R'hllor had set fire to his own robes to make a point and had been found the next morning complaining that the gods had a poor sense of humor. They always have, Lemore said, and the men around her laughed without malice because they had learned she could laugh at herself as easily as at them. The stranger least of all. He never laughs, and yet he is in every joke. Perhaps best not to invite him, Haldon murmured. We invited him when we lit the first fire in the first rain, Jon said. He comes where he likes and sits where the seat is warm. In the morning a man came running as if the wind had loaned him its legs. He was small and wiry, one of Maris's nephews perhaps, or a grandson of a man who had set nets before Robert had even dreamed of line and hook. He had run from the bluffs above the older road west, and his chest made the bellows sound that means a heart will be punished for a few minutes and then forgive you if you are lucky. Riders, he said to the first soldier, who had the sense to hold out a flask and not to ask for tribute before giving it. From the north, not Reach Green, not Renly's laughers, antlers, stags, the hard kind. Stannis, Duck said, and there was no fear in it, only a quick pulling together of what men do when another serious man is about to enter their day. Or men who wish to remind us his brother was king. Stag is a hard shape to paint right, Haldon observed. The curve of antler in the right place or the wrong tells a hillman from a hired man. But yes, Stannis is a word in this air now. They came at noon, riding at the pace of men who had not wasted horses but had not conserved them either. Their captain wore plain steel and a face like flint that had been rained on for years and learned not to be softened by it. He drew up before Aegon without indulging himself in a tour of the camp's weaknesses. He had already counted them on the ride in. "My lord," he said stiffly to Jon. "The prince," Jon said. The man turned his eyes to Aegon. He did not flinch or blink. He took in the hair and the level lip and the way the boy had learned to keep his shoulders and knees telling the same story. He took in the Sel's words like an old thorn in a newer paw. He said, in the accents of Stonehelm or something near it, "My lord sends you a puzzle. He says, if you are who you say, you will not want to steal what is his. If you are not, you will." "Your lord," Aegon said. "Stannis Baratheon," the man said, with no embellishment and no need for any. "He is lord of this castle by law and right, and will be king by law and right when the chaff has been blown from the field. He keeps Dragonstone for now because the business of kingship requires patience. He knows Storm's End as a man knows the bone of his own forearm. He does not share what is his, and he does not laugh." "I know he does not laugh," Aegon said lightly, and then caught the man's flicker and adjusted. "He does not spend laughter on work. It is a virtue in some pursuits and a vice in others. I did not come to steal Storm's End. I came to ask the men within it whether they wish to stand under a sky that is not green or crimson." The captain's mouth moved, not in mockery, but as if keeping his face straight cost him something and he was willing to pay it. "My lord says the sky is gray to honest men. He says if you mean to stand under that sky, you should ride to Dragonstone and lay your name upon his table and ask him to weigh it. He says he will weigh it with iron, not with singers." "I will take ship," Aegon said after a breath, and 3 men behind him made involuntary sounds at once. Haldon's soft intake of interest, Duck's grunt of willingness for the work, Jon's low cough that was not a cough so much as a man remembering a dozen currents under the water and wishing to put them into a boy's mouth without drowning him. But not yet. The captain nodded as if a minor expectation had been met and he could cross off a line on his mental list and go to the next. He expected you to be proud. He says pride is a horse you can ride if you feed it oats made from grain you grew yourself. He says, tell the boy he is not the first to say his name in front of a castle and expect it to change its behavior. He says, tell him if he is the last, you will all be lucky. What does he say about the lion? Aegon asked. That he is a butcher's child who has learned where the knives are kept, the captain said, and that he will not forget it. The man left with as little fuss as he had arrived. When he was gone, Haldon laughed once, like a man who has read a line in a book he has read 3 times and found the author had hidden a joke inside it and he had not seen it until now. What? Duck demanded, aggrieved. Nothing, Haldon said. Only that we keep borrowing time from men who do not charge the same interest. Stannis will let us owe him longer than Renly and at a better rate. But he will collect at the end with the same thoroughness as Varys, and I am not sure which of those fates is gentler. We will pay, Aegon said simply. With our choosing. We will always pay with our choosing. They were 3 days under the headland with their pale banner when the first cart from Broad Arch came creaking up the low path out of the west. Iron-bound wheels complaining like men who have been asked to carry something below their station. The cart contained oats and a message in the way the oats were bagged. The mess. Age said, I pay in a shape that will not be seen from the road. Morrigan sent a hawk hooded in green leather with a ribbon around his leg, a black feather bound to it. The feather meant, we remember. Wild sent men who walked with their heads aslant under rain, and whose faces did not change when they touched the cloth of Aegon's banner briefly with their fingers as if to reassure themselves it was not paint. Tarth sent the boy again with a letter more careful than the first, and a loaf shaped like the head of a lion with the nose scorched deliberately. Fell sent nothing at all, and then on the 4th morning came himself. Lord Fell in a cloak still wet from Mistwood's stubborn weather, smelling of old dogs and the leather of saddles. He did not waste courtesy. He looked from Aegon's hair to Aegon's hands, and then at the set of his shoulders, and then at Jon, and did the same, and if he judged Jon more sternly, he did not make a show of it. Your face is not Robert's, he said to Aegon, as if that were a beginning that pleased him. I have been told that by men who meant the words kindly and by others who meant them as a warning, Aegon said. I take them both as one. Lord Fell gave a quick nod of acceptance that was almost respect and almost the thing men do when they find a nail has not bent under their hammer. Come and eat, he said. You have been living like poor men to prove something. We have been living like poor men because we are poor, Aegon said, and then because he knew when to curb the honesty that could become habit in a prideful mouth, and because we will not be liars even for the comfort of it. In the pale hall of his tent with a carpet laid down to keep the damp from climbing into the bones of his ambition, Aegon ate Lord Fell's bread and cheese and cut his meat himself with the knife they gave him rather than with his own. He spoke of the world like a ledger that had the wrong numbers in the wrong columns and needed someone to sit up late and put each figure where it belonged. He did not speak of vengeance. He did not speak of dragons that exist only in tapestries. He did not tell Lord Fell that he needed him. He told Lord Fell he would be well served by his own dignity if he chose this side of the ridge and not the other. Fell swallowed a mouthful of wine and then set the cup down as if its rim were a ring he did not intend to put on. My father starved under those walls, he said without ceremony, jutting his chin towards Storm's End. He ate onion and expected to die and lived and hated the onions later only because his wife cooked them poorly. He would not let a Baratheon name shame a guest. He would have told me to hear you. He would have told me Rhaegar's son is a better chance at not choking on lies than a boy with roses on his sleeves. He lifted his eyes to Aegon. Do you forgive me for hating your grandfather like a man hates winter? Yes, Aegon said, as if the question had been expected and had spooned itself into a bowl in his head long ago waiting to be fed. I forgive you for hating men you did not know. I ask you to care about men you can. I am one. The boys who will be born under a better sky are the others. You will not know their names. They will not know yours. If you like, we can count that as love. Lord Fell drew in a breath through his teeth, the way a man takes down the first mouthful of an icy river when thrown into it unexpectedly. You speak like a boy who has not yet lived 40 years. It is everything that is good in you, and it is everything that will break. Send me a letter with your seal bound to it, and I will keep it under my pillow for a night and pretend I did not notice. After that, I will answer. When he had gone, Harry Strickland rubbed at the lines that had deepened beside his mouth in the last week, as if they could be smoothed back into a younger habit. He will come, he said, surprising John, who had expected calculation before commitment. He smelt the South in you and found not enough to frighten him. He will come because he wants a dry granary more than a joke well told. Renly will not march, Halden said. He will throw a feast and call it a march. That is another kind of marching, Lemore said, toward the kind of king he believes himself to be. Aegon sent riders to Nightsong that night with a letter he had rewritten thrice in the space of an hour, not because the words would change the world, but because his own tongue had to lay itself down in the right shape for the man at the other end of the road to trust his weight. He did not sleep long. When he slept, he did so as if he were standing, all muscles a little ready for arrogant dawn. The next morning, the captain at the gate lowered a rope with a small basket at the end of it, and in the basket there was a candle sealed in wax and a folded scrap that read, "You may light it when you come. It will not betray you here." There was no signature. There was the smell of salt in the paper, as if the man had written it with his elbows on a windowsill where the wind did not stay out and had not wanted to. Aegon held the candle in his hands for a long time, not because wax wanted warmth, but because there was a piety in simple objects given with reluctance. Then he put it carefully among Halden's inkpots and the pouch of coins John kept too near his cot, and the small carved thing Lemore carried for comfort that she had never named. He did not light it. News came with the speed men reserved for news about other men's armies. Renly's camp glittered near Bitterbridge, so bright with satin you could have used it to signal ships. Men laughed there, and girls laughed, and boys made their names trying to make girls laugh louder. A crown had been made of antlers sawed from stag heads taken by hunters who had never seen a field where battle had put its iron down. Lord Randall Tarley had frowned at the laughter and provided order around the edges, so that no one rode their horse into a cookfire or lost a hand to a man with poor table manners. Mace Tyrell looked at Renly as if the boy on the throne of grass were a boy in a green cradle he had woven himself. In a tent near the edge of that meadow, a woman with hair the color of wheat kept her face still and called herself queen already. In another tent, a girl in boy's mail cleaned her blade and refused wine unless it was thin and spiced, and then refused it again because a man had offered it to her with eyes she did not like. Aegon listened and did not speak of queens and women. He spoke of roads. He sent a small force to the north and west to meet men who had decided in their own halls and wanted to be escorted through other men's doubts. He sent duck south to the marches to look upon the faces of stewards who would make any oath their lords asked them to, and to weigh if the lords were asking the right ones. He sent John to Rain House with a letter that was no different from any other and yet would be received differently because of the man who carried it. It was not the same Rain House. Of course it could not be. The air was the same, fish and tar and the sweetness that comes when the sun warms the salt in the cracks between stones. But the men on the walls were newer, and the woman who met John in the hall was girl to the woman he had known when he had been unwise in his own skin. She had her grandmother's mouth and her father's caution. She wore her hair bound up tight so that it could not betray her moods. "You write a very proper letter for a man who broke so many rules," she said after greetings were done with and bread and salt taken and humor established lightly with the old trick of teasing him for having grown drier rather than softer. "I wrote it under the eye of a man who knows the way the Stormlands uses certain words," John said. "And because I am old enough now to write for the person who must read me rather than for the person I wished to be when I wrote myself first." "Does he have your true name?" she asked. "He has the one I can bear," John said. He did not flinch. He did not say the prince's name again because to say it too often in a day makes it cheap, and a man must learn the thrift of true things. She considered. "We will not fly to him," she said. "We have storms of our own to keep at bay, but we will not close our shutters. If he is there next week, I will send my brother to see what kind of fire keeps his men warm. If he is there next month, I will send my steward to count his loaves. If he is there when the first leaves fall, I will come myself." "Do that," Jon said. He took the little wooden charm from his pocket that Rhaegar had once carved in a night when he had not been able to sleep and had wanted to make the world less heavy for someone by making something with his hands, and he set it on the shelf by the door of the hall without explaining to any man that he had done it. He left before he could understand whether the act had been wise or merely private. On the 5th morning, the wind that had flirted with them since their arrival threw its skirts over its head and became a weather fit for songs. It did not line the rain up and march it. It sent it in loops and swirls so that men could not decide whether to curse or to laugh. The sea took the opportunity to show off and threw a line of spray high enough to be seen from the farther tents. The smell of kelp and old wars rode the gusts like a familiar. Over it, faint and then stronger, came a sound newer to this stretch of coast. The low, long moan of horns, not the bright trumpets of a feast, but the serious throats of men who mean to move other men with breath. Storm's End answered with one of its own. It was neither welcome nor warning. It was the sound a house makes when it reminds itself that it will sit here when boys who call themselves kings have been boiled down into adjectives. Aegon stood out in it and did not cover his hair. He listened to the horn and then to the silence afterward, and in that silence there were footsteps, many disciplined, from the west road, Renly finally moving with his laughter tucked into his belt for later, or from the north, Stannis with his law like a blade he washed carefully before using. Haldon tilted his head and let the wind feed his ear from different corners. Jon only watched the boy and then the gate and then the line where those footsteps would appear. It was not an army that came, not yet. It was perhaps 200 men in good order with a crispness that suggested a commander who cared about the sentences he wrote in the field and wanted to be understood. Their banner was a crowned stag, black upon gold, as plain and irrevocable as a judge's coin. The men who bore it did not grin. The commander wore a plain surcoat with the sigil worked small, not shouting his allegiance. He brought his men to within 50 paces of the pale dragon and stopped them with a hand sign that would have pleased any Stormlands drillmaster. He bowed from the saddle to Aegon and then to Jon. "Ser Gilbert," he said, naming himself as if men should already know the name, and if they did not it was no shame for either party. He had the face of a man who would not be handsome no matter what the gods did with the rest of him, and had accepted this and permitted himself other virtues instead. "We are sent by Stannis Baratheon to keep Storm's End from becoming a stage for small men. Do we look small to you?" Duck asked cheerfully. "All men look small when you stand this close to a wall like that," Ser Gilbert said dryly. "I did not say you were less than you are. I said my lord knows how men turn such hours into theater that gets boys killed." "Tell your lord," Aegon said, "that I have stood in that gate and been given a candle against the dark. Tell him I have decided not to set fires where the stone is older than my will. Tell him I will come to him when I can call the men I must call by name and have them answer with something other than fear. In the meantime, I will make no mischief here." Ser Gilbert regarded him. "My lord says if you are a mummer, he will cut the strings that move you. If you are a prince, he will weigh you with iron and say yes or no. He says if you are a boy, you had better find men who will teach you how to be something else before he must teach you himself." "Then we are agreed," Aegon said, "that boys should study." The man's mouth tugged in spite of itself. "We are agreed on nothing," he said, but his tone had softened a half hair. "We will camp yonder, on the slope that watches the west road. We will not hinder you. We will cut down any bravos who try to turn this into a dance." "Do not cut too freely," Jon said. "Blood joins quickly here. It joins the wrong people most often." "We are not Tyrells," the man said, and bowed again and rode off with a precision that was almost stirring. When the long line of them had unrolled toward the chosen ground and set about the business of tents and cookfires with an economy that would have pleased Stannis himself had he stooped to be pleased, Duck let out a long breath through his nose like a horse. "Now we have 2 walls," he said, "one of stone and one of men's minds. I begin to want a third, something with food in it." "The carts have begun," Haldon reminded him. "A week more and we will look like a country fair come to stay." "We do not look like that now?" Duck said, glancing at Maris's boys playing at soldiers with sticks and at the old man from the weeping town who had taken it upon himself to become camp cobbler and was lecturing his apprentice on the moral value of knowing where a boot's weakness lies. We look like a fair where the oxen have learned to recite their own price. Dusk again. The day shrank like a cloth washed too hot. In that slow dimming, a figure came walking up from the south with a staff and a satchel, and the kind of walk men no means the walker has clocked too many roads to waste breath on noticing one more. He wore a brown robe, neither septons nor monks. He had the air of men who have traded names the way other men trade horses. Carefully, with want. His beard was white at the chin and darker at the cheeks, as if a joke had been made upon his face by a god who liked pranks without targets. He stopped before Aegon without bowing. He looked at the boy and then at Jon and then at the pale banner and then at Storm's End and finally at his own hands, as if to see whose work they had been doing without consulting him. When he spoke, his voice was the voice of a man who had sung when he was young and had learned to speak softly later to spare what was left of his throat. "They told me there was a dragon sleeping on the heath," he said. "I came to see if it dreamt men or gold." "Men," Aegon said. "Gold is other men's dream of us." The old man smiled with one side of his mouth. The other side might have been busy counting debts owed to it. "You speak like the priests across the water," he said. "You smell less like smoke. Perhaps that is because you have not had to burn anything yet." "We have burned time," Haldon said gently. "That we all burn," the man said. "My name has been a few things. For today it can be Maester Adamar, retired by the sea. I have taught children with too much coin and too little patience. I have written letters for men who wanted to trick other men with them, and a few for men who wanted to save them with them. I came because when castles stir, the man who lives under them should move a little as well, to keep from being crushed when they lie down again." "You are welcome," Aegon said. "I am not," the old man said amiably. "Old men with ideas are never welcome where the weather already has too much to say. But I am old and take my welcome from the way the ground does not throw me back. Will you let me sit near your fire for a week and see if your fire warms the right things?" Aegon glanced to Haldon, who gave the smallest nod, to Lemore, whose mouth said "be kind" without his needing it, and to Jon, whose silence said "we are not the only ones who watch." "Sit," he said. "Teach me without telling me you teach me. And when you go, leave me one thing I did not have before that does not add to my pride." "Very well," the old man said, seating himself with the careful indifference of age. "I will show you how the Stormlands cut eels, so that they do not slip out of one's hands and make a liar of your knife." He did. The camp watched, first out of mockery and then out of interest and finally out of the gratitude men feel when a small skill is given into their hands and makes the day inch easier toward the night. Aegon took the knife and cut as he was shown and did not mind when the eel twitched and made his sleeve dirty. He laughed at himself quietly and cut the next one better. Jon watched the knife angle and the boy's wrists and marveled at the way the world did not always require blood for a lesson. On the 7th morning, when the pale banner had frayed slightly at its lower edge and Haldon had mended it with thread that did not match because thread never does in the field, a rider came from Nightsong with a clean beard and a dirty cloak and fatigue layered under his eyes as if he had slept under 3 worries. He went to his knee before he reached Aegon's shadow and bent his head without drama. "My lord bids you to his hall," he said. "He will not leave it for men who think the roads owe them passage. You will come without army, with 50 men and 2 cooks. You will eat our bread and we will eat yours. You will not put your hand upon your sword, because if you do you will not live to finish the gesture. You will stay 3 days and then leave and neither of us will laugh at the other in public for a month." Aegon smiled with the front of his mouth again. "That last is the best part," he said. "I accept." He chose his 50 with the care a man gives to the first words of a letter. He knows men will keep folded in their pockets and read at odd hours until the edges soften and the ink blurs. Duck would go because Duck would go where the boy went until the day he could not and would not apologize for it. Haldon would go because books were always hiding in other men's houses waiting for a polite thief. Lemore would stay because someone must mother the men who would not be mothered by their own grief. Jon debated with himself for the space of an hour and then went, because he could not bear to let the boy walk into a room with men he had hurt long ago without standing in the door and being counted among those who hurt them. They rode west under a sky that changed its mind 6 times and then decided to do nothing at all just to spite them. The road fell in and out of the grips of small valleys like a drunk coming and going from the hatch of a wine cellar. Men called to them from hedges with warnings they had already heard. Boys ran behind as long as their lungs let them and then stopped and shouted promises to catch up later when their legs had learned to be men. At the first stream they crossed, a woman in a red skirt was washing a blanket with such ferocity that Lemore would have told her she would have no blanket left if Lemore had been there to do so. At the second, a man sat with his feet in the water and his hands on his knees and looked as if he had decided to be a stone rather than a father for an hour. Nightsong rose among its own hills like something that had grown out of the ground reluctantly and then found the air to its liking. Its stone had a different color, a darker, more musical gray, if a man can call rock musical without lying. The nightingales on the banners at its gate were carved, not painted. Their tiny beaks open as if they had been caught mid-note and would go on singing after the carver's grand chi. Ldren were dust. Lord Karen received them in a hall that had been built to make men raise their eyes. He stood at the far end, not on a dais, but where the shadows made a crown above his hair and a gravity below his boots. He did not waste the first minutes. He looked at Aegon long and at the men around him longer and then at Jon longest of all. When he spoke, his voice had the iron of an old grudge in it and the fatigue of a man who wishes to put down a burden he has carried so long it feels like his spine. "You are not him," he said to Aegon. "No," the boy said. "And you are not your grandfather," he said, unnecessary but necessary. "No," Aegon said again. "You are not the sum of their debts," Karen said. "You have your own to contract and your own to default. That is the only reason I let you in." He gestured, and servants moved with the smoothness that says a household has rehearsed grace for generations. "Sit, eat, then try to seduce me with words. It will go better on a full stomach." They ate. It was the food of the hills. Barley layered with mushrooms and onion and cubes of salted pork that the cook had coaxed back toward tenderness with slow flame. A stew that lived somewhere between broth and argument. A dark crust that broke under teeth and made a sound that suggested the right moral life. The wine was from the Dornish marches and had heat in it that was not weather. Aegon ate like a man who remembered lessons of an East that prized small bites and like a boy who had learned in the last week that the Stormlands would forgive him for frowning at overly precious manners. When the bowls went aside and the bread left only crumbs and a memory of its smell, Lord Karen leaned back against an old cushion that had been repaired 6 times by 6 different women with 6 different ideas about what thread should do. He looked at Aegon as if at a student whose essay had proven unexpectedly interesting. "If I told you," he said, "that I loved Renly Baratheon because he was the last thing in this world that made me laugh when I was alone, and I loved him like a man loves the sight of his house from a hill after wars, and I loved him like a boy who is not yet done being cruel to himself for having been a boy in the first place, what would you answer? That you will not forgive me for coming into your house with a name that hurts you," Aegon said, "and that if I ask you to forgive me, I am asking you to cheat grief. I will not ask. I will ask you to hold 2 things at once. We are not good at that," he added, and there was that quick flash of humor at his own expense again. "Men, we prefer to hold 1 thing. But if you hold 2 at once, you will be a better lord for your people and a better man for the boy you were. Hold the memory of the man you loved and the possibility of the man I might be. Hold them. If they crowd you, put me down for an hour and keep him." Lord Karen's mouth opened and then closed like a man who has realized the word he thought would be useful is a poor tool for the job he has to do. He hung his head a moment and then lifted it and filled his chest with air as if air had been scarce and he had just found some. "Your father," he said when he could, and the word came out not as an accusation but as something for which the correct ritual had not been established, "was a man who lost the habit of plain speech," Aegon said. "We are trying to reacquire it in this house." He smiled without showing teeth. "We fail. We are children of our own mistakes, but we try." Lord Karen laughed then, 1 bark and then a longer release. "You have not asked me for men," he said. "I will," Aegon said. "Not tonight." Tonight I ask you for the thing you are poorest at, patience." Karen stared as if someone had put a mirror before him he did not like. Then he nodded just once, and it was like the movement of something large in the deep. "You shall have it," he said, "for 3 weeks. If after that you are still here and have not turned into a joke, I will give you my voice, and perhaps my swords, and perhaps, if the gods tear their own hair out in surprise, my heart." Aegon inclined his head. "I will try to keep you from hairless gods," he said. They stayed 3 days in Nightsong. Aegon walked the wall with a captain whose grandfather had done the same with a boy named Robert, who had been so hungry for the world that he had eaten it without chewing and then choked upon it later. He spoke to a woman who scrubbed floors with the economizing fury of those who have not been paid in 4 months and made her laugh by taking her brush and kneeling beside her for 5 minutes and failing to get the same shine out of the flagstones. He asked the maester whether the small boys reading the lives of the 3 saints were being given the good copy or the one with the missing leaves, and told him to give them the good copy and let the missing leaves remain missing for the men who thought they'd earned them. He met a nightingale carver with hands the shape of cleverness and listened for an hour to the way the carver spoke of wood grain, as if he were speaking of men's temperaments and not of the way fibers lie in a trunk. He did not attempt to seduce anyone. He did not make promises he could not keep. When a quick-tongued knight made a cutting joke about John Connington that would have drawn blood years ago, Aegon said, "He has failed better than most men succeed," and let the silence after that sentence prove its own arithmetic. When they rowed back east, the wind had settled into an older rhyme. The sea threw up a line of white at the base of Storm's End as if to mark the place where its appetite ended for the day. Ser Gilbert's small, fierce camp looked like a knot a careful hand had tied with disciplined twine. Renly's banners still muddied the horizon with their green, but there was a hang to them now, a heaviness, as if the wind had grown tired of carrying so much color for so little argument. At the gate, the basket came down again with the candle. Aegon tied to it, with a clean cord, a single coin from the east with a dragon on one side and a king on the other, and sent it up without note. After a time the basket came down empty and then up again with the coin returned and a different wax on it. Storm's End seal pressed there, a stave and a wave. Jon's throat tightened the way throats do when men are not prepared to be moved. He went to stand with the boy on the low rise in the evening and watched the walls darken from gray to black. He thought of the way 2 years from now certain men would be dead. Of the way 2 years in the past, none of them had imagined this exact wind upon this exact skin. He thought of the red woman rumored on Dragonstone and let the thought pass through him and out again like a bad meal. He thought of Rhaegar tuning a string. "You have made a beginning," he said. "I have made a noise at a gate," Aegon said. "Perhaps that is all a beginning is. And now we send to Dorne again and say the thing we did not say the first time about sorrow," Aegon answered. "Now we send Duck to Tarth with a letter in which I make no mention of daughters. Now we go to Rain House and stand where some ghosts are mine and some are yours and some belong to no one we love. Now we ask Stannis whether he would have our bread at Dragonstone. And then we wait for a storm to decide whether it will pass over or sit. You will be asked to be cruel," Jon said, "because it was better to say what must be said in a quiet hour than in the noisy ones. By the weather, by the law, by men who want their own comfort more than our aim. You will be asked to be kind, too, and that is sometimes the crueler thing. I do not know which you will choose. I only know that if you know you are choosing, perhaps we will survive our own X." Aegon looked at the wall, the line of it as firm as a good sentence. His hair took a breath of wind and then was still. In the camp behind them, someone laughed and someone else cursed and a third man sang a line of a song so old the words had turned to sound and the sound to a sort of prayer. Far to the west, a horn spoke, and all the voices fell for a moment to listen, because men like to know when they are at the beginning of something even if they do not yet know how it will end. The horn's note settled upon the heath and upon the rim of the sea and upon the roof of Storm's End where it did not soak in and did not roll off. It lived there a little while and then was gone. The boy who might be king stood still and let that silence be his cloak. Jon Connington stood with him and let the years be his weight and his answer. The Stormlands breathed, and for a little time the breathing was in time with their own.